So I've got a 2004 Nissan Maxima, and I've decided to replace pretty much most of the front suspension and the steering rack and all the power steering hoses. So just kind of want to make this quick, but there's just a few things that I wish I had known before I started. First off, I disconnected all of the suspension. I got the struts out, started by disconnecting the tie rod ends and the sway bar links. Those were pretty difficult actually. They took an 18 millimeter wrench and socket to remove, and I had to come in with an impact up from the bottom of behind the lower control arm, and had to use an impact wrench and a swivel on that back end of this nut, because the nut is on this side and the sway bar comes up from this side up to the strut or sway bar link. And so you need an 18 millimeter to get the piece that's on. There's a little rounded square nut on part of the bolt here, and then the nut is on the back side. So that one was one of the more difficult ones, and it was really on there. I couldn't do it with a wrench with my ratchet and extension, because you can't really get an extension or cheater bar on that wrench, and so I had to use an impact gun. Let's see. I guess to start off, you want to probably want to drain the fluid out of your hoses, and like I said, I decided to replace all the hoses. If I was going to replace the rack, I might as well do all the hoses, plus I think the high pressure line was leaking anyway at the pump. So the best way to probably drain it, I think, is there's a little bracket to hold that hose there, and then if you come up towards the front, there's that bracket. I'd take those out, and since I was removing the hoses, I actually bent this aluminum piece down. I disconnected it there, so this line is the one that comes from the gear and goes to the cooler, and disconnect that, and then I just with the car off, turn the steering wheel back and forth a bunch of times until fluid stopped coming out of it. And then the other part to drain almost all of the fluid is getting that disconnected right there. It's the suction line from the reservoir to the pump, and that's the power steering pump right there. So that's the high pressure line coming out of the pump, and there is the high pressure or the pressure sensor or pressure switch. It's got a wire plugged into it. You'll have to disconnect that eventually. So after you get all the fluid drained out, the next best thing I think to do would be to come over here, and obviously you can see I got the new rack already put back in, but come in from the driver's side, and there's those two fittings on the gear. There's the high pressure hose on the left coming in, and then that one going from the gear to the cooler. It's just got a rubber piece here and then goes to aluminum. So you can disconnect those, take those fittings out. They're just sleeve nuts over the top of a hose. This is just, the rubber hose is just attached to a little, basically just a little piece of metal hose that has an O-ring on the inside, on the gear side, as well as the high pressure hose has an O-ring at the bottom. The high pressure, it's a 14 millimeter and a 17 millimeter that will take to get those off, and you can just and you need a end wrench, preferably one that has shaved sides, so it's got thin ends on it. Would be really beneficial and helpful to get these off, because there is very, very limited space to work around that in there. So once you get those lines off, most of your fluid is going to be drained out anyway, so it'll be okay. You can disconnect the knuckle here from the from this piece on the rack. My old rack had, my new rack didn't come with it, but the old one had this little rubber piece with that plastic, and it's for indexing where the position that sits in relative to the steering wheel, and I wish I had known that. So mine was pretty rusted on. It was really, really hard to get off. So what I had to do was, obviously there's a pinch bolt that goes through there. I took that pinch bolt out and tried to pry, and was supposed to be some movement, I was told, up that steering shaft, up to the steering wheel, but it did not want to budge off of there. So what I ended up doing was I ended up coming inside. So obviously you want to tie that steering wheel off somehow to keep it from moving at all and rotating and free spinning once it's off, because there's wires that will break, and that would be a very bad day. So come in here, and there's this joint right there coming off the back of the steering wheel. So what I did was I had to disconnect this, and it's got kind of a funny shape on the top there, but that's because the bolt going through this piece right here has an oval shape to it that sits in that groove, and I think it allows that to have a little bit of movement in here. But so I was able to finally, well, don't want to lose that. So that's where it goes through the floorboard, and I was able to finally yank it off the top of the steering rack with a lot of effort. So let's see. I guess after you get that disconnected, pretty much the only thing you have left to do is get the 19mm bolts from underneath right there. There's one there, and then there's one over on the other side. Right, yeah, right there. And those two are the two that hold the rack to the subframe, so you can disconnect those. And then, I don't know that it's completely needed, but might help, is disconnecting the sway bar bushings. I put new sway bar bushings in, so you can disconnect those with the 14mm. The one in the back on the right side there, I thought was easier from underneath the car, and then this other one just from the wheel well side here. And so I actually removed those and pushed the sway bar. It only has like an inch or so to actually move back out of the way, but it might help. So once you get all those disconnected, you can lift that. In fact, the rack I got underneath the car and lifted, it's just enough so I could slide it over, because the nuts on the back side there, oh, there's a wire in, I need to put back, but those nuts are held in place, so you don't have to worry about getting to them, and that bolt from under the car, you can just take that bolt out, and then your rack is kind of free. But it sits in these little brackets on both sides welded to the subframe, so you have to lift it up and then pull it out. And it is kind of tight getting it out, but if you have it disconnected there, you can lift it up and kind of turn it just a little bit. From this side it'd be counterclockwise, just so it kind of comes out of there, and it came out fairly easy. I made the mistake of leaving those two hoses connected to the gear and disconnected them from the other side, and I think that was it would have been easier to disconnect them here. I just didn't think I had enough room. I didn't realize that I actually do have enough room to reach back in there, but I don't have huge arms, and I'm not a super big guy, so if you got big arms, then it will be pretty difficult to do this job. To remove the rest of the power steering hoses, so the cooler sits in here from the front, just in front of the AC condenser, and that one, what you have to do is, to get the other one out and get the new one in, was dismount, well, take this plastic grill off, and then take this plastic trim piece off the top, and then take the grill off. It just has these little push. Disconnect or dismount the radiator and the AC condenser, and then you can kind of see it there inside. You have to mount or unmount those, and kind of see down there on the bottom if it'll focus, which it doesn't look like. There we go. That is the beginning of the cooler line, and so it goes in, but you have to disconnect them so you can slide it out of this little gap right here. So you have to dismount your radiator and that AC condenser and slide them back towards the engine so that you can get the cooler out of there, and then put the new one in. And that's why you want to take this piece off, because it's a lot easier to get to that down there to remove it and put the new one in. So then it has a hose from the cooler that comes up here and goes right there, and it's got a couple little mounting brackets like the one underneath. You can see one of those brackets right there. So you have to remove that with a couple bolts. Right now I've got the coolant reservoir removed, and I've got this reservoir, the power steering fluid reservoir, and you can just slide it up off of the it just slides up out. I didn't realize that it just slides up out of this little bracket there. But then, so that's the suction line that goes from here and goes down to the pump. Kind of see it there. But that part, I wish I'd known that that part is a dealer part. It'll cost you about $25 for that hose. I don't think I'd recommend just going and just getting rubber hose, because it does have a few bends in it. I can just show you real quick. It's got a J-hook bend right there at the bottom that goes into the pump. And I don't know that I'd risk it without getting the molded hose. So yeah, that's pretty much the hoses. If you include the suction hose, there is actually 5 different hoses that you have to get. And then putting the new rack back in, I just kind of did it in the reverse order that I told you. Oh, first off, high pressure hose, getting back to that. So that there, and the switch. One of the worst things about it, I mean, it was really, actually, surprisingly bad trying to get that to line up. You see there's a little stud on the bottom of that hose that goes there, or the fitting for the hose into the pump, and that stud has to line up with that, and then you have to kind of go blind lining that bolt up to go into the pump. And it's got 2 copper seals for your high pressure hose going into the pump, because it is up there at I can't remember how many psi. It's like 12 to 1800 psi is what the pump is supposed to be putting out, and yeah, that's a lot. So that its seal is pretty important. But there's that switch. I left the high pressure sensor, and I didn't get a new high pressure sensor. But that connection, actually, that electrical connection, trying to get that undone was really harder than it should have been for me. But one thing I also didn't know, or actually 2 things, is there is, let's see if I can get down here enough to see, but way up there in the top, it's really hard to try and put 2 hands in here at the same time. way up there, the top of that high pressure hose, there's a bracket, and it is, you can't see the bolt on it, but there's a bolt on top there, and it mounts that bracket to the back of the intake manifold, and you have to basically reach in from the bottom here to get that, and you have to do it all blind. It sucks really, really bad, and putting it in was just as bad or worse than getting it out. Like I said, putting that in really sucked also. So yeah, and then there's also a bracket. I don't know if I can see it from here. Okay, so you can kind of see right. Let's see, where's my finger at? So right, where's my top here? So I can point at it. Oh, there's just no good way to do that, is there? Anyway. Right there, there's a little gap. There's a bracket on that high pressure hose that mounts right there. My old one, I didn't know that there was a bracket that mounted right there, because my old one, the bolts, there's two bolts that are supposed to mount that in there and mount this high pressure hose coming out to that. And you can kind of see the nut on the back side of it, or I guess towards the front of the car. And then two little things there. Anyway, those bolts were missing, and so I don't have bolts to put back in there, but I am going to find something that will go in and hold that high pressure hose in place coming out of the rack, because I feel that is pretty important to have those two, at least one of those bolts in there. So basically, once you get everything out, I would recommend, I pulled this high pressure fitting off before I pulled the rack out, and just pulled it out with the rack. And I would recommend waiting and then doing everything in the reverse order, putting that hose in, putting all your power steering hoses, except the one going from the gear to the cooler. In fact, you could even just put your rack in first. Obviously, you want to put your bushings back in. If you want to do those, the sway bar bushings first, put those in before you put your rack back in. Then put your rack in and then connect the hoses to the rack. Probably put this high pressure hose in first before you put this guy in, especially because this is kind of mounted there, and you need all the room you can get to get up in there to get that and the bracket up top mounted. So yeah, those are a few things I wish I had known before I started on this project, because it really was not very fun, and it was the first time that I've ever tried anything like this on a vehicle. But anyway, one more thing. Because of that little piece on the rack there, because that little piece there, I lost the spot on it, so it has little grooves to fit in the splines on that stud coming out. And it, like I said, is an indexing thing to tell you where to put the steering wheel. If it's not lined up right, your steering wheel might turn farther one way than the other, or your steering wheel will be off to one side or the other. So you want to get that lined up in the right spot. Basically what I'm going to have to do is kind of trial and error. Right now it's indexed close to where it needs to be. It might be a couple splines off one way or the other, but I'm going to have to just connect it up how I put it on there. So I'll connect that up without putting the pinch bolt in, and then I will turn the steering wheel with the car off because I haven't put any fluid in yet. But I'll turn the steering wheel lock to lock and see if it turns the exact same from the straight up position both ways. If it doesn't, if it turns one way farther than the other, then I will just pull that off and adjust. Alright, this is now after the suspension has been mounted. Got the sway bar link attached there and to the sway bar. I got my outer tie rod ends measured out and attached to my knuckle there, and then my knuckle bolts to the strut with the brake cable and the anti-lock brake grommets back. These both sides fit just perfect, just like they're supposed to, so I guess we'll see how it works out. Good luck.